Welcome to my office in Riga, Latvia. This is so weird and awkward to be sitting here and talking to myself, but hopefully some of you will join me and join in on the conversation. It is a very cloudy, very gray day in Riga. It's about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's been not a rainy, not a snowy day, but just clouds, clouds, clouds. No sky today. And it is, let's see, the end of March. No, the middle of March. See, this is what happens during during the pandemic. You don't know what time it is or what day it is. Um, but we are mostly inside here in Latvia. We're still going through some restrictions, and I think for the most part, people are being really cautious. We haven't quite gotten to the level of vaccinations that some of my friends in the United States have received, and so uh, mostly based out of this office right now. And so here's how things are going to work today. Thank you. I see a few people actually are here. It's good to see you too. So, what I'm going to do today is I thought, after asking a few folks to share their stories and people saying, well, when are you going to share your story? We have questions for you. I thought, okay, well, let me try out this newfangled technology thing and give a little bit of insight of why I started this page, Saprotu, where it came from, and what my experiences were leading up to this. And I'm just going to riff for an hour or a little bit more about myself. And certainly, I would love for folks to ask me questions, give comments, and yeah, just share in the conversation if they can. So I'll talk a little bit about my story from start to finish, or maybe not finish till now. And I'd like to preface by saying, keep in mind that these are certainly my opinions and my experiences of different places. A lot of what we've done with Saprotu is we're really trying to explore the influence of place and culture on people. And that really boils down to one person's subjective experiences of that place. So certainly everything I'm going to talk about today are my thoughts and yeah, musings on all of the places I've been and how they've influenced me. And then later on, we'll get to my journey outside of my what I would consider my home culture and what I've learned from that. So yeah, I please ask me questions. I'm looking down at notes. I'll try not to do that too much. I'm sitting in my office. I also teach English as a side gig, so I have my map and all of my wonderful things here in the background. And yeah, feel free to participate, ask questions. I'll stop every once in a while to answer questions. I'll try to answer questions that are relevant to the part of my story that I'm talking about right away, and some of them I might hold on to the end. So Cece, I will definitely talk about Minnesota when we get to Minnesota. And yeah, so this is me. This is so weird talking to myself, but I know that you all are out there and that you're watching and listening too. So here's me. I have lived in a lot of places. I was born in New York City. Let's see if I can give you a little bit of a picture of that. Bear with me here. So here's little me. I was born in New York City, which is, as many of you know, a really big city in the United States. And I was kind of born in this era between the super digital age and the analog age. So I'm not really Gen X, I'm not really millennial, I'm somewhere there in the middle. And some things I remember about my childhood in New York City was that it was a place that had a lot of life, and I interacted with a lot of different people all the time. So I have, certainly from a child's memory, I have memories of lots of colorful people, quite literally, people in multicolored clothes, people singing, talking, kind of that busyness of the city, people with multicolored hair. Where I was born was, I would say, kind of the epicenter of some of the punk 1980s stuff going on in New York City. And my parents were artists too, so I was also surrounded by interesting characters who were friends with my parents. I remember once some folks did like an art film that involved myself. And part of living in that colorful community was also meeting a lot of folks from different cultures. So from a very young age, I do remember getting Polish sausage from the little store around the corner. And because I was a kid, they would give me free sausages every time I walked in. There was an Italian bakery right underneath our apartment that would give me cookies, and one down the street that taught me what cannolis were. We were a couple of blocks from what's called Little India in New York City, and I remember eating Indian food as a little kid. And so I had this real awareness that there were lots of different kinds of people who spoke different languages and ate different things and had different smells and dressed different ways. And I think some of that is because I was a little kid and I remember all the things that I liked and all the people who were really nice to me. But when I was about 6, my parents decided to move to the middle of the United States, which some of you who aren't from the United States may not know exactly where this is, but we moved to a state called Minnesota, which is right in the middle of the United States, right at the top, right next to the Canadian border. And we moved there. My understanding of why we moved there had a lot to do with the fact that both sets of my grandparents were there. So my dad's mom was there and my mom's parents were there. And later in my adulthood, I understood maybe a little bit better some of the complexities to living in a place like New York. It's expensive, it's dirty, it's maybe not safe in some regards to raising kids. And so, but at the time, I think some of my really twinkly memories of New York as a kid come from the fact that I missed it, and I missed some of this colorful, life later on. And so those are some of the things that stand out to me about that place. And so we moved to Minnesota. Minnesota does have a couple of larger cities, but we lived in a smaller town of about 24,000 people at the time. And so very much a change from big buildings, lots of people, to individual houses and green yards and what in the United States we would call a suburban feel. And right away, I was spending a lot of time with my grandparents. Actually, when I was smaller in New York, I was also spending time with my grandparents in the summer in Minnesota. And so I think a lot of my memories there are connected with nature, probably because it was such a big contrast to my previous life in New York. There really wasn't a lot of greenery around, and I do remember a lot of time spent with my parents exploring woods and rivers and looking for rocks and those kinds of things, which is a really wonderful memory. The other piece of it was that I actually had a really hard time adjusting as well. I wasn't particularly, I was viewed as different in my school, which, again, when you think about it, small kids, 6, 7 years old, aren't always the best at accepting outsiders, and I was an outsider, and so I really struggled for a while especially when I was younger. A little bit later, I decided to embrace that as valuing something that was different, and I kind of maybe emphasized that part of my personality as a way to accept some of that. And so yeah, in Minnesota, it was kind of a contrast of both of those things. It was a lot about being in this nice big open space. Certainly, it was my schooling period. Schooling being sometimes difficult because of relationships with other kids and other peers. But I would say I had a pretty decent schooling. It certainly wasn't horrible from an educational standpoint. And a big piece of my kind of life in Minnesota also involved family. And I think that was a big emphasis, again, because we moved there to be with family, and I spent a lot of time with my extended family. And so one of the things is that I have a younger sister, and she was born just before we moved to Minnesota. So I had a sibling that was with me who kind of was one of my companions. And I spent a lot of time also with my grandparents. And one side note, because I think it's a big part of my story, is that my mom's parents were immigrants. And my mom actually technically also was a first generation immigrant to the US. And so my grandfather, who's this wonderful guy right here in the middle, and my smiling face over there on the side, and this is my mom and my aunts. My grandparents fled Latvia when World War II happened. And that's a way oversimplification of the story. But basically, they decided to flee war and ended up, long story short, in Germany, which is where a lot of refugees and what were called at the time displaced persons were. And so basically, folks lived in these refugee camps for anywhere from a couple to 5, 6, 7 years. And as the war ended, the way they divided up Germany, the country that controlled that area of Germany, which was mostly the Allies, so we're talking about Australia, UK, US, actually the Soviets as well at the time, they made some decisions around how they were going to deal with these refugees. And so my grandparents were in a camp in the American zone. And so the Americans, along with several nonprofits in the US, organized what to do with these refugees. And mostly what they did is they found sponsors in various countries around the world who would help pay for passage and then bring those folks to that place. It started a lot with workers, so a lot of single men who could help rebuild after the war. And then they started slowly accepting families as well, families with children. And so my grandparents had fled Latvia. My mom was actually born in one of these displaced persons camps. So she was born in Germany in this kind of neutral zone. And after some time, they were able to get sponsorship as a family, rather than my grandfather having to go somewhere ahead. And I do remember him saying that he had an opportunity to go to Australia first, but that he decided not to go there because he thought things would be too different for him, which is interesting given our conversations about culture. So he basically waited until he got a sponsorship to the United States. And what that looked like was that there was a group of Lutheran churches in the United States who specifically raised money and again sponsored folks. My grandparents and my mother went on a boat to the United States through Ellis Island in New York City, and then were taken on as workers, helpers on a farm in the middle of nowhere, quite literally in the middle of the United States. And they worked there for 2 years with this family until it was deemed that they had worked off this passage. And then after that, they were allowed to settle, and they settled in Minnesota because they happened to know a few other families that they had met in these displaced persons camps in that place. So that's kind of a long side note, but I think the fact that my grandparents were refugees and involuntarily left the place that they were from really formulated their view of culture. And so by their, the way that came across is that it was really important to be part of the culture that they had left, and that because they hadn't left it voluntarily, and that was really important to hold on to it because at some point you would go back to it, which is part of my story too. And so I grew up speaking the language. I grew up with my grandparents cooking that food. I grew up with other Latvian children learning Latvian. There was actually a church and a school that happened on Saturdays, which made me a little bit different from the other American kids. And so because I was an outsider coming from New York to Minnesota, and I was also this outsider because I had a house that looked different and we ate weird food and we spoke a language other than English, it really made me want to embrace that idea of being different. And so that was a big piece of who I was in Minnesota, and I think also a big influence as to why I left Minnesota when I went to university. You know, some angsty teenage stuff. I think some of that is an influence as well. And so, yeah, let me just check. Oh, hello, everyone. I see so many people talking. Thank you. I see a couple of questions from folks, and I think I'll get to some of the reflections of things I miss about places a little bit later once I get through a little bit more of my story. But yeah, I will talk about the healthcare system too, because I think that's a big piece of my move here abroad. But so I was in New York. I went to Minnesota for most of my childhood, and then when I reached university time, I think typical teenager wants to get out and see the world, I decided to go back to New York City. So I applied to a number of universities, and only one of them was in the state that I was in because I had this idea of, I'm different, I need to go do different things, let me go across at least the United States. Funny enough, I never considered going internationally for that. I don't know why. I don't know that it's super common in the United States to go to university in a different country, so maybe that's part of it. Oh, but let me say something before I talk about university. See, I can't even keep my own story straight. So this whole thing about family and cultural influence, is that when I was 10, my family started sending me to Latvia. And what that means is that there's me with my little midsummer crown on. What that means is that my parents brought me to Latvia, and they connected me with relatives who um, had remained in Latvia. And I spent a number of summers in my elementary school and secondary school years in Latvia with cousins, mostly second cousins, but still fairly close. My grandparents' siblings, grandchildren, children and grandchildren, and um, and so pretty early on, from the age of 10, I had this kind of idea that there was another place that did things another way. It wasn't the first time that I had traveled. My parents had traveled with me internationally when I was a bit younger too. But I spent a lot of my childhood and teenage summers in Latvia, um, in the countryside and in the city. And I also spent a few years doing high school in Latvia. It was a summer high school program that was actually created by American Latvians who whose goal was to have Latvians from Latvia, um, kids from about the age of 13 to 16, 12 to 16, and a few kids, about one third of the kids were from outside of Latvia. And so they were having this group of teenagers interact and spend time together in different parts of Latvia. Kind of camp style. It was very academic during the day. We actually did classes. We had teachers. We had some pretty serious, hardcore learning. We had homework, but then we also had activities, and mostly traditional activities: dancing, craft, poetry and art, those kinds of things. We had a camp newspaper. And so I spent, I think, 3 or 4 summers doing that and spending time with peers here. And so I had spent time in Latvia, and felt like I had really belonged to kind of two places: the place that I was growing up, and my friends and my schooling there, and then also this other place that I had literal blood family living. I was learning more of the language. My language wasn't very good when I was small, even though my family spoke the language and encouraged us to speak the language. But of course, spending full summers where I wasn't speaking any English at all, my language improved, and I learned a lot. And so that kind of happened in between. And then I hit college and the early part of my career. And although I did go to Latvia still after that point, it happened a bit less often because of money and time. It just wasn't as possible. And so here's me going off to college in New York City and saying goodbye to my family. And so New York City, as a slightly older, I mean, I'm a teenager, I'm a young person. I think I have very similar reflections to the ones that I had as a kid, in terms of really loving the amount of people and different things happening in New York City. Certainly, it was the age of I'm going to school, I'm learning things, I love to learn, I get to meet all sorts of different people. And, so that was really, like a great, I'm in my 20s, I'm doing things. I had a boyfriend who was a musician, and I was going out and riding the subway late at night, and kind of that young person feeling invincible and having all these stimuli because I'm in a city. And so I spent some time in New York City because I went to university, and then I did my master's degree in social work also in the city. And that was interesting as well because doing social work in the city really had me interact with people who had lived and grown up in New York City, but also people from different classes, different ethnicities, different races, different backgrounds in general, experiencing life in a different way from me. Um, and and yeah, so I spent about 10 years in New York City as an adult, university and post-university. And um, and like it would be again an oversimplification of my story, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot about different people. I was growing up, and living out the fun of my 20s, but also, learning how I needed to be an adult, um, doing school, doing working jobs, my first real jobs post my master's degree. And yeah, and so there was a certain point in my late 20s where I could also see the not so positive things about New York City, where I really realized that if I were to stay there, it would be expensive to live there. I think I was really reflecting on the nature and the open spaces that I had grown up in Minnesota and really missed that and felt like if I stayed in New York City, I wouldn't be able to have that in the same way. And so I started looking for a way out to go somewhere else. I think the city also has a certain pace that I wanted to slow down. I was no longer in my early 20s and having all that energy. And so I was looking for a place to be. And long story short, I ended up in the southeastern US. And that partly came from me literally looking at a map and being like, I don't want to be in a city, which is a lot of the east coast of the US. And I want to be somewhere interesting. I want there to be enough of other people that I can live an interesting life. So, what is that like? And ended up actually doing a road trip around to different places and settled in a place called Asheville, which is in the mountains. That's about 3 or 4 hours from the coast, from the sea, the ocean, I guess you would call it. I really liked the nature of that place. It was a huge contrast again to New York City. And also, it really was a very calm place compared to New York City. So I had lived over 10 years in a place that was constantly busy, constantly rushing, people constantly coming at you and telling you what to do. And this place was very, very calm. People moved slowly at their own time. They spoke slowly. They were much more understanding and gracious. Again, this is my opinion, but it's the way I see it. I really enjoyed the directness of New York. I really liked how people told you what they thought. But what I really loved about living in the South is that people really meant it when they wanted to know how you were doing. And they would ask that to complete strangers, so they would say hello to you and want to know, you were in their space. And so come into my space and come into my conversation. And I thought that was really good for me as a transition to go from this fast pace of life to this really slow and calm pace of life, much less stress, much more enjoyable. I'm trying to see if I have a picture of that. I don't know that I do, but a beautiful place in the mountains, and really continued to pursue my career there, and also met my husband there. And so my husband is from close to Atlanta in Georgia, which is also in the southern US, and is a very distinctively different culture from Minnesota, which is very Scandinavian style for folks who know what that means, kind of reserved, a little quieter. a little more cautious, very different from New York City, which is very direct and loud and in your face and kind of doing what they want to do. And so the Southern story is very different for lots of complex American history reasons that I'm not going to get into now. But so I really lived in these three different places and bounced around a couple more times. I went back to Minnesota as an adult for a few years, and then I went back to North Carolina again for a few years. And I'm going to kind of skip over that because I feel like I've been telling my story here for a while. And again, I'm awkwardly talking to myself, but I'm glad that y'all are still watching. And there's my little Southern thing because I did pick up the word y'all, which I really like, even though it feels a little bit odd coming out of my mouth. Oh, sveiki, Elena. So I am getting to the point where I'm going to tell you why I'm here and why I started this page. So thanks for sitting through 30 minutes of me talking about my background. And so having done all my youthful things, having been a young adult and feeling like I had explored and lived my life and started my career and really established myself, I felt like I was in a position of thinking about, okay, so what do I do next? And it wasn't exactly a midlife crisis, but I think, after you're told as a young person, and I think this is pretty, universal. But, as a young person, you're told you have these certain steps you take in life. And for a lot of people, that's school, that's having some kind of partner, maybe having a family, but you're kind of told you have these things happening. And I felt like I had achieved a lot of those initial things. And so you start to think about, okay, so what do I do with my life now? And what's important to me? And I think because of the influence of my family, because I had spent so much time thinking about this other place that I was actually spending time in, that I had family in, and a place that I could have in some ways returned to, I decided why not? It really came down to a decision of, could I go abroad? Yes, it's something I could figure out to do and something that would offer me some challenge and something that would give me another story and another something to explore in my life. And so I really left everything, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about. I think my attitude at the time was that if I decided to do something, I could do it. And simply that I would just have to make a set of decisions about how logistically to follow that through, and then process the best I could emotionally how that would happen. So I left a job that I really liked. That was a very stable and good job. And gave them plenty of time so that we could really kind of wrap that up and end that. It also, we had a house, we owned a house, and had been living in a house for a few years, and that was a really long logistical process of fixing it and spending every waking moment outside of work on the house, and God bless my husband, who really knows a lot more about that and really helped us fix that house to a point where we could sell it. And then a lot of logistical, starting to look into what paperwork we needed to do to be able to move abroad. And I do have to say that my story might be a little bit different from some expats, because I did have Latvian citizenship due to my grandparents. They had the foresight to request Latvian citizenship for me, since I had a direct line, a direct lineage of Latvian citizenship coming down from my grandparents to my mother to me. And so I had already had Latvian citizenship. And so it was always an option for me to be able to live here. That being said, there's still a certain amount of paperwork to establish residency here. And so I was looking into what that process is like, having a passport, having an ID, what I needed to go through with immigration, so that I would have a starting point here. And so, gosh, I know I can see a few of you have stuck with me here. If anyone has any questions on anything that I've said so far, you're welcome to type it in the chat. I love that Cece is writing me lots of messages. I am seeing them. It is such a weird thing to try to have a conversation with the world and then also be keeping track of everything here on the side. But hello to everybody who's joining us. And I reflexively say us because this project is myself and my husband's brainchild, and so that's kind of my automatic reaction. So here's the thing. I decided that I was going to do it. We gave ourselves a year to do all the logistical things that were required to be able to physically move. So dealing with our housing on that side, okay, I see your question, Cece. I will speak to that as best as I can. And dealing with housing on the Latvian side, so where were we going to live, dealing with money, in terms of ending one job and how were we going to have money to live on the other side, at least until we found work. And so, wow, where do I even start? So I arrived in this place that I had been numerous times before. My husband had actually been here 3 times for varying periods of time, but more than a week, months. And he certainly had also said, okay, let's do this. And he was ready for it. And I would say that the experience has been different than I could have ever imagined. And it's a big piece of why I created Saprotu. Because basically what I realized is, and this is going to sound overly common sense, but when you're in it, it feels different. Living somewhere abroad, whether it's for a short period of time as a student, or you have a job abroad, or you're doing it for a longer term period of time, whatever your circumstances are, living abroad is so much different than visiting abroad, period. And I wasn't prepared for that. So I told myself logically, okay, I can go through all these steps of things I have to do. I told myself that emotionally, I knew that it would be hard and that it would be different. But that's really the extent that you can tell yourself that, or that you can prepare for that. And so here are some of the things that happened when I got here. And I'm going to mostly speak to my experience. I am going to, in the future, maybe a few interviews down the line, I'll interview my husband as well, because he has a different perspective. And I'll speak a little bit to his story maybe, but I don't want to speak for him, so I'll try not to do that too much. When we first got here, we were focused on where we were going to live and establishing some really basic things. And I think that's probably pretty universal for folks showing up in a new place. And so we were able to find a place to live through family. And we were very lucky in that way that we had a good place to land. And I had a good sense of the immigration paperwork process. And so for us as Americans, we had a 90-day window where you're allowed as an American to travel into the EU. And so we had this 90-day window, 3 months, that we had to finish a process with immigration here in Latvia to be able to stay here as residents. And for me, because I'm a citizen, my piece of it was fairly straightforward. I actually did have to renew my passport. I didn't have my married name on my passport, so I had to go through a process, actually even prior to coming here, to change my last name officially, which was a lot of bureaucracy of having like official things stamped and sent to the Latvian embassy in the United States, who sent it to Latvia, who registered my new name in the register, and so on and so forth. And so when I got here, I needed to get a new passport and an ID. And once I had that, we went to immigration together. And I had and downloaded, it was available on the Latvian immigration website, the paperwork that I needed to fill out, which I had already researched in advance. It was all in Latvian, so I helped my husband fill it out. And I would say that the process was pretty straightforward. We went in, I brought literally every document we had. I had gotten as many documents apostilled, which are kind of these international notary things. I had gotten them approved prior to coming. So I brought literally a folder of everything about us, all our IDs, all our bank information, so on and so forth, and sat as someone asked us questions and looked at the form that we had filled out to be able to live here. And it was pretty straightforward. Do you have this? Yes, here it is. Do you have this? Yes, here it is. There were a couple of things that they were like, well, we want this way. We want the physical signature instead of a copy of a signature. But at the end of the meeting, they were like, okay, we're putting you forward in the process. One note I will make, positive or negative, I'm really not making a huge judgment about it in the moment, but they did not speak any English at all, and they only addressed me and not my husband. And so I really, and my husband, who does not speak the language, certainly not on a communication level that you could understand at immigration. And so it really made me reflect on, geez, like I'm glad that I was there, able to be there for him, and how difficult it must be for folks who don't speak the language and are showing up and not here because they speak the language or because they have a particular connection to Latvia, and that could be really difficult. It was just a little bit odd that she looked at me and she talked to me even though she was talking about my husband and he was sitting right next to me. But the process itself was straightforward. And as I'm showing at this moment, I am here and they approved us, which basically means that they approved me as a Latvian citizen coming back to Latvia and residing in Latvia. And because I was legally married to my husband, he also received residency because basically, as a legal spouse of a Latvian citizen, he had the right to live here. And so that was one of the big things that we needed to accomplish. Okay, if we're going to stay here, we have to have approval to stay here. And then we started working on other things. And I quickly realized that a lot of this was overwhelming. Simple things that I knew how to do. I was an adult, super competent. All of a sudden, I didn't know how to do anything. And again, this is coming from the perspective of someone who speaks the language of the new country. And I'm showing up, and I remember once I went into like a corner store, and I had gotten my husband this like prepared salad because he was hungry. And I was interacting with the cashier because I was speaking the language. And he said, how do I eat this? Like, because there's no utensil. And it was like this big crisis in this moment because I was like, where are the utensils? It's not like the way I'm familiar in the States where all the utensils are either next to all the prepared food or at the cash register. So I didn't see them in either of those two places. For some reason, the name for spoon blanked out of my head at that moment. And I'm trying to explain to the girl, like, how do we eat this? And the girl's looking at me like, what the heck are you talking about? I don't understand you. What do you want from me? And finally, I kind of like spit it out. Like, I don't even remember what I said that finally triggered a response, but I was like asking, she wasn't understanding. I was asking, she wasn't understanding. And it turned out that the stupid spoon was on the inside of the cover, like in this like little plastic thing that you put together. And it was with the thing. And it was this example of how even the most simple things seemed really, really different and really, really difficult. And I very quickly started to get overwhelmed living here. Meaning, again, like I felt like I had gone from being a perfectly competent adult who knew how to do things to a place where I really had to learn everything over again like a baby, like a child, and couldn't assume that I knew anything. And I think I felt overwhelmed probably because I felt really vulnerable. I had to be vulnerable all the time and say that I didn't know how to do anything all the time. And my early strategy was to choose one thing every day or every few days and be okay with the goal that I would learn one thing and that I wouldn't try to do the normal amount of things that I would do on a regular basis. But today I'm going to learn how to read a map of buses and understand what bus comes to what stop, what time they come, and how I can get to the destination I want to go. Actually, that was several days worth of research trying to understand how to use the public transportation system, where to buy a ticket for it. You know, a lot of these things involve a lot more steps than you realize because you just learn how to do them when you're living in a particular place. And so, yeah, I learned how to read the transportation route, how to understand the timetables of when things were coming, how to figure out where to get off if I was trying to go to a particular destination, and also where to get the transportation cards, how to fill them, how to ask for them, what they were called, how much they cost, so on and so forth. And so I would just choose one thing and be like, okay, it's okay that you're doing something that's at such a much simpler level than other people who already live here. They already know how to do all these things. You're learning all these things from scratch. Groceries were another thing. It's like I know how to go to a grocery store and buy food, but some of the food is different. And for some reason, I had a really hard time figuring out, like, how do I make a meal? Because it's not the things that I'm used to eating or seeing. And so how do I make something that feels as comforting and good as making a meal, like the way I used to make meals? And so, yeah, I really spent a really long time, months, doing these things, trying to pick up and check off understanding some of these really basic things around how to literally navigate this place, and also how to, you know, at the same time doing some of these governmental bureaucratic things that I had to do for us to be able to stay here. And so it was really difficult for a really long time. And I realized at a certain point, one of the really wonderful things that I had discovered is that there are a couple of expat groups on Facebook. And there were folks like me who were asking pretty simple questions. Where do you find this weird item, where how I'm hungry for this kind of food, where how do I get that? Or does someone have a recommendation for someone who can help with this? And that really gave me a sense of a community of other people who were feeling that way too, and would ask similar questions and were in a similar situation. And someone at one point posted this article that talked about how expats are more prone to depression, um, or maybe not more prone to depression than normal people, but that expats are prone to depression because they're out of their comfort zone, they're out of their support system, and they're kind of dealing with some significant challenges. And I don't know that that article made me realize it, but at some point I realized that I had become really, really depressed, and felt really out of my depth. And it was really surprising to me. And maybe part of that too was the fact that I had come up against this idea that, I was in this place that I supposedly knew and that I supposedly was even a part of in some way, shape, or form, and then realizing how much I wasn't a local and wasn't really part of this place, and was just a visitor, and was maybe a lot more influenced by the places that I had lived, my home country of the United States. Um, and it really made me start to think about people's individual experiences. And that's, again, a lot where this project came out of, because I was thinking a lot by myself about, why am I feeling this way? Why is this so difficult for me? Why is it such a challenge? And slowly realizing that this challenge existed for a lot of other people who were shifting from one culture to another culture for all different reasons, for work reasons, for love reasons, for studying reasons. And that it's not kind of a straight line or a straight process, but that it can be really challenging to go through this really deep exploration of the self, and really questioning everything that you know and who you are. And so being able to openly talk about that seemed like something that became really important to me, because I felt so alone when I wasn't talking to people about it. And then as I realized that other expats were going through similar experiences in their own ways, it felt really important to validate those experiences and not like, oh, this wasn't my experience. So like, I've never had a hard time buying salad at the corner store. That's not helpful. And so I wanted to be able to have conversations with folks about, okay, here are the things that I've found joy in, here are the strategies that helped me, and here are the things that I found challenging, or that I even outright reject, that I don't accept from this culture, that I prefer to kind of keep the way that I used to do things, because it's a balancing act. You're coming to the table with your own stuff, and then you're coming and trying to respect a new culture that you're in, and live in that culture without completely kind of assimilating your old self. So that's kind of my statement about expat mental health. And I continue to really think about that pretty intensely and pretty often. But let's do some fun stuff, because that's also kind of heavy duty. And I see that a couple folks asked about some kind of comparisons and contrasts between things. So one thing is that someone asked about the healthcare system. I find the healthcare system vastly different. As some folks might know, the United States has a very privatized healthcare system. There really isn't a lot of public healthcare available, except for folks who work for the government. Then there's some socialized healthcare. And Latvia has a kind of base level, foundation level public healthcare system, and then they have private healthcare on top of that as additional options. And so in the United States, to share my personal experience, typically at times where I had a lesser paying job, especially when I was younger, I did not have insurance. So I was not insured at all, which meant that if I went to the hospital or if something happened to me, I would have to pay out of my pocket hundreds or even thousands of dollars, and for basic care. And luckily, most of the jobs that I worked offered some basic sense of healthcare, but you are paying usually at least a few $100s per month out of your paycheck to have what's called a deductible plan. So that means that you have like you can have a doctor who's approved within that system that you're paying, and you can see that doctor, but you're paying down a certain amount. And that's different for different systems, different programs. So for example, in one job, I had to pay down $1,000 of my own money before the insurance fully kicked in and kind of gave me money back. And so it's pretty common in the United States, and people are pretty used to spending thousands of dollars on healthcare a year. On being able to have it, not even necessarily using it. In Latvia, the system, again, is my experience of the system, being a Latvian citizen and being entitled to the local healthcare here, is that you have a basic level of being able to have a family doctor. You have to choose a family doctor. And lots of family doctors are full, meaning they have a full roster. They can't take on new patients. But through some education, you can figure out and find out which family doctors are open. Certainly not all of them speak English. I would guess, some of them do. Generally in Latvia, side note, younger generations speak more English than older generations. That has a lot of historical things to do with it, but also I think just our younger generations are a bit more global now and speak English more in general. And so I can go to the doctor, have them, weigh me, look at me, write me prescriptions, and I pay €2, which is the equivalent of maybe $3 or $4 to go see the doctor. That's my out-of-pocket cost. The rest of it is taken care of by the Latvian government. My personal experience is that I also have a chronic illness, which means that I have a specialist that I go see, and I take daily medication. So I have a consistent prescription. And my prescription in the United States, first off, again, I have to have a health insurance to be able to see the specialist, or I'm paying hundreds of dollars out of my pocket to be able to go see them and have them write me that prescription. In Latvia, my family doctor can write me that prescription. I told them that I had that diagnosis. Certainly I came with my diagnosis from the US, and I pay 71 euro cents for a 30-day supply of my prescription, whereas in the US, out of pocket, I'm paying at least a couple $100s for that same prescription. And so I find on a basic level, for me personally, the healthcare gives me a certain sense of security. I know that on a baseline I'm covered. And then in Latvia, you also have private providers as well. And private providers generally speak English. There's a lot of medical tourism in Latvia because Latvia is generally cheaper than other parts of Europe. And so you can go see a specialist. I paid out of pocket to go see a private specialist because there are some longer lines for public insurance and being able to see specialists. And so I paid my specialist 35 euros out of pocket, which again is about 40 US, a little bit more maybe, to see like again, I feel like I've said it 5 times, but a specialist. My husband got some dental work done here. Also private, out of pocket, super high tech, speaking English, really great experience. And it was probably about a quarter of the cost of what it would cost in the United States. I will make a side note that Latvians make significantly less, locals make significantly less than they do in the United States. And so that private insurance, those private doctors and dentists might not be as accessible to the local population unless you're making a larger wage. But for an American, and having come from such an expensive healthcare system and such a privatized healthcare system, it feels really, really, really cheap. And that's been a really wonderful thing. I think another really positive contrast with the United States, and again, this is my personal opinion, my personal experience, but I find the food here to be less processed. And I have some sense of EU regulations having banned some things that are still allowed to be in food in the US, but also there's a much higher emphasis on fresh food here. People go to the grocery store more often and they're buying fresh fruits and vegetables. And in general, even processed food is less processed. Whereas a lot of American food you buy in large quantities, you hold on to it. A lot of frozen food, which is not very common here. People are kind of like, why are you buying frozen food? And less additives and preservatives in things. Not that they don't exist, but in general, I don't find that in the same way in the food here as I did in the United States. We have had to tweak how we buy groceries because in the United States, I would go shopping maybe once a week, once every other week, and buy a large amount of food that would last us for a couple of weeks. And again, mostly frozen food because that lasts a longer period of time, some fresh food, and some kind of preserved food. Soup and things like that that you can keep for a longer period of time, canned food. And here, again, people go every couple days to the grocery store. And living in an apartment where I walk 4 floors up, with my nearest grocery store being a few blocks away, I can't vibe with that. I can't transition over completely to that way of doing things, although I love the food that I have access to. And so I guess one of the positives of the pandemic is folks figuring out how to do delivery services. And so I can get free delivery of groceries, of a larger amount of groceries. I don't typically buy for 2 weeks like I used to in the United States, but I do buy for at least 1 week and plan out my week's worth of food. And it's mostly fresh. It's mostly fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, some dry goods like cereals and breads and meat. And that's kind of the extent of what we're eating here versus, I think, again, in the United States, mostly frozen food, some processed things, and even fresh things being really often having a lot of preservatives and processed things in it. It tastes different. I mean, I don't know how to say it otherwise. Let's see. I think living in a city, I've really enjoyed living in a city, and there's a lot of things that are happening here all the time. There's a huge emphasis on culture in Latvian culture in general, meaning art, music, and pre-pandemic, a lot of things were happening where you would have just public art and public performances happening in public spaces where a lot of folks were out and about, and a lot of kids out and about being brought into those things, and it being like a collective experience, which is really wonderful. I certainly miss the diversity of the United States in terms of seeing such a large amount of, I guess, particular ethnicities, which is kind of an odd thing to say because as I'm talking, I'm thinking about this. In Latvia, I live in a big city and I do come into contact with a lot of expats. The expat community, as another expat, they're really open and often are inviting people into their spaces. And so I've met a lot of people who know a lot about the world, which is really, really amazing. So people from other places, but who also have an awareness of the bigger world. And I feel like in the US, it's a bit more insular. You're not always thinking globally, but I do miss some of the folks that I grew up with in terms of, I grew up around a pretty big Vietnamese population. And so I've been looking for Vietnamese food in Riga. Thankfully, there's some really good Vietnamese food here. Certainly, there aren't, I haven't encountered Native American culture here in Latvia. Certainly, there's no African American culture here in Latvia. And so some of those things that felt really familiar in the US, I do really miss. Latvia, because of its history, had been isolated inside the Soviet Union for a while. And so there's also a lot of historical reasons that Latvia is probably a bit more homogenous than the rest of Europe. That being said, I've met a lot of young folks who, again, because of the internet, because of how the world works these days, we have more access to the globe. And so I've found a lot of young people with open attitudes towards that. That being said, one of the biggest challenges for me living here, again, despite speaking the language, despite looking like a lot of the locals, is that kind of that human interaction element is really, really different for me. I've realized how much the places I've lived in the United States have influenced how I am and how I interact with other people. And in general, Latvia, if I had to generalize, and again, this is my opinion, but people are really, really reserved. They don't typically strike up conversations with strangers. They don't typically share any kind of emotions with people they don't know super well. And that's made it really, really hard to connect and feel like I'm making friends or getting to know local people. If I were honest, probably even my family members who know me really well and who I've known for many years aren't chatty, don't check in often. And I think in American culture, you have people check in a lot. I think I talk to my immediate family every few days. I talk to friends at least once a week where I can. Sorry for those of you who I haven't. I'll blame being so far away. But I think in general, you're talking to people a lot and you're interacting with people a lot through conversation, through sharing emotions. Americans are very friendly in that they get to know people. There's a lot of chatting that happens, and that doesn't happen here. You can drop a pin inside of a store and hear it because no one says literally a peep. And again, I've had some experiences where that's not been the case, but having been here for a while, I mostly was making friends with expats and finding common interests where people were really open to, again, having other people come in and share experiences. One thing I did is I joined a book club. They are amazing. I love them. They were my first group of friends that I really could have a conversation with and find some common ground, talking to them about things. And I will side note that COVID has really, really shut down a lot of my ability to adjust here. Being that people who are already reserved have been even more insular and closed off. And so I was lucky enough to meet a couple of local folks, having put out a call for language, a language exchange where I would speak English and they would speak Latvian to me. And so I was able to meet a couple of locals that started with meetings in real life that was able to transition online. I was invited into a couple of conversations about my experience being someone who moved to Latvia, and those conversations were in Latvian. And so, like, I've had a couple of people who have interacted with me, who have heard my story of coming to Latvia and who have interacted with me. But really, like, every opportunity for me to actually go out and be in spaces where people might want to meet new people have been shut down. And that's been really, really difficult for me because I feel like I'm basically this American who's living a mostly American life in a different place. And that I really could be living this life in any place at this point. I don't feel particularly rooted here. I think because of my background of ethnically being linked to this place, I feel a connection here, but I don't necessarily feel rooted here in terms of this is a place that I belong, or that anybody really particularly wants or needs me here, which is kind of an odd thing to say, but I think when you're an expat, you think a lot about belonging and where you fit. And ultimately, a lot of us make decisions about where we live because we feel comfortable there and we feel some sense of a network of support or belonging. And so I can't really say if I would feel any different in terms of my sense of belonging here if COVID hadn't happened, because of course it did. I can say that I think it probably would have been because we were kind of building up in our interactions with other people directly prior to last March when things started shutting down here in Latvia. And so I would have hoped that that would have happened, but really my only interactions in the last year have mostly been bureaucratic interactions, which frankly have not been positive. I've had a lot of really negative people yelling at me and not being understanding or not being welcoming, which has really again challenged my my sense of being here. One wonderful thing that I'll say that's helped me cope again is the expat community. I've found some places where expats are kind of open to sharing their gripes about the challenges of living in a different culture where people do things differently than you're used to. And again, I think that's really important because it is, yeah, frankly, it makes me mad when someone says, no, that's not like that, or this is just this way, because the world is way more complex than that. And so if someone says, I've had a really challenging time at this place, what they're really asking for you to say is, man, that's really awful. Rather than saying, oh yeah, that's the way it is for everybody. Well, that doesn't make that better. Or I've never had that experience. Well, so what? I did. And so I think it's really, again, important for people to be able to have that ability to share that openly. Because frankly, that happens in our home countries as well. Yeah, empathize. I think people, again, people go through this process where they're trying to figure out, where do I fit? Because I'm not from this culture and I want to respect this culture, but I also am who I am and come with all the influences and all the wonderful things that maybe different perspectives that I'm bringing to the table. and you want to be valued for that. And you also want people to value the fact that you're trying to be in a place that's so different. And it feels incredibly invalidating when someone basically says you're not trying hard enough, because the process is already so difficult. And yeah, and so that's why I really love having these conversations with folks. I think everybody has had a different experience where parts have been easier, parts have been harder, um, have lots of different reasons for leaving their home culture. And I haven't griped as much about my home culture as I have at times. I think there are reasons that you leave places, and then there are reasons to stay, and I think that fluctuates over time too, right? So when the balance turns again, then you go and find your new place. And at least for me, I've found that place in a lot of different physical places over time. I'm looking at my notes. So when I first got here, also I was trying to process what are things that I love and what are things that drive me crazy. And I'm kind of looking at some of these early lists that I wrote. Is I think I have a love-hate relationship with this city because I love being in a city and I love being with lots of people. This city is different than other cities I've lived in. I think because it's a smaller city, it's a little bit less than 700,000 people. People have a different sense of space here than I'm used to. And again, this is totally based on my experience, but having lived in New York City, where you get out of people's way, people here don't do that. People here will walk straight at you on the sidewalk, and that drives me absolutely crazy. It's not anything I would have ever thought would be like one of my top gripes of this place. I would have thought it would have been something else. But I think it's based on the fact that I've lived in cities and places where people are very conscious of personal space and get out of your way. And there's a totally different concept of personal space here. Even though people are reserved and try to, I think, conversationally or emotionally stay out of your space, physically, they very much don't. Yeah. And it drives me crazy. And it drives, and I've heard other expats that drives them crazy. And then this is also one of the things that I've shared with other people, and they're like, no, that's not like that. And I was like, yeah, it is. So I don't know, maybe tell me if it's been like that for you as well or not. I think I also realized that the American system is really detailed in terms of its explanations of things. And again, something I never realized, that when I go to a bureaucratic space in the US or anywhere where I have to go through some kind of process, I'm usually told the whole process. So I'm told, okay, you're going to do this first, and then you're going to do this, and then you're going to do this, and then you might have to wait for a little bit, and then this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. And you're either told the list or you're given the list, and usually it might even happen a few different ways. Meaning they tell you, and then they give you a list, and then they email it to you, blah, 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 blah. And here, you go and you accomplish one thing, and then you go back to the desk and they say, okay, now you do this. And then you go accomplish that thing, and then you have to come back to the desk and they say, okay, now you do this. And gosh, I never valued the fact that I had like, or that he even needed or wanted like a whole list of the entire process from start to finish, until I wasn't privy to that kind of a process anymore. So that was a big contrast, again, that I didn't realize until I was in it. Oh, another weird thing, time. Time to me is weird. This should be one of my cultural thoughts of the week. So in general, things in Riga open around 10 a.m., which, again, having lived in some other cities, that's really late for me. People go to work at what I would consider a normal time, 7, 8, 9 in the morning. but things don't open until later. And that I didn't understand that at first, and now I've gotten used to it, but I still don't quite understand it. Also, things don't close until really late. There is a very big social alcohol culture here, meaning people go to places to drink and socialize. I think it's maybe, again, my personal theory is that it helps kind of this more reserved culture relax, and they interact a lot more and socialize a lot more when alcohol is involved. And it's pretty common for folks to go out and spend the weekends doing that. Again, very different from the United States. I think people do that, but not in quite the same way as it being like a really emphasized thing here. And in New York, I don't remember super well, but I think bars, there's something in the United States called last call. So bars, there's a law in each city, in each place when things close. And generally the bartenders will say, this is the last call. This is the last drink that you can have, and then we're closing after this. So come and get your last call drink. And in Latvia, that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. I've been told by several bars that they stay open until the last person decides to leave. Like there's no law or rule. And again, comment, correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe if there are any locals watching, tell me that this is wrong. But I have been told by several folks working in bars that they stay open until the last person leaves. And that might be 7 a.m., that might be 8 a.m. And I'm talking about all of this because the time shift tends to be a little bit later in the morning and going into like the early hours of the next morning on the weekend. And so the city is really, really quiet, and I find it really peaceful on weekend mornings, and much later, and yeah, way later than I would expect in the US. So like, for example, I have neighbors downstairs that I know for a few different reasons, and they have to be in their 70s, I would guess, maybe even a little bit older. They told me once that I could call them because they stay up. They do not go to sleep until like midnight or 1 o'clock. And thank you, Elena. Yes, again, it's just something different. It's something surprising to me. And so, yeah, my older neighbors who are like grandparent age don't go to sleep until midnight or 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and every night of the week, not even just the weekends. And my friends and I found I have totally shifted. Oh, there are a lot of moonshine sellers. I like that. That is one thing I can identify with, because there are a lot of moonshine sellers in North Carolina as well, which has a very regulated alcohol system. That's a story for another day. But I found that because the culture itself has shifted, for me, is that I now stay up incredibly late. So what I remember of my schedule when I was working at the university, living in the United States, I woke up at 5:30 in the morning and would go to work, and I would go to sleep by 10:30. I would shoot to be in bed. And on the weekends, I lived in a quiet, sleepy place. I would still have like that pattern. So I would still, maybe sometimes I would stay up late, but every once in a while, like every once in a blue moon, as you would say in English, which means like once a month, once every few months, I would stay up until midnight-ish. And I'm thinking back to my 20s in New York City too. I mean, I would go out on the weekends, certainly, and there were times I stayed up until 1 or 2 o'clock. But again, last call's at 2 a.m. And so everybody's going home. And even if they're going to someone's house to hang out, you're staying up till like maybe 3 or 4 in the morning and you're crashing at your friend's house. But I find that in general, I know a lot of older people here who stay up a lot later. And so my whole thing has shifted. It's crazy. I totally go to sleep on a regular basis now after midnight, and don't wake up nearly as early in the morning, except for in the summer when there's like crazy sun here, which is a wonderful thing. And so that has been an unexpected shift for me, not something I could have prepared for. If anyone has any questions or any comments, I'm kind of wrapping up here, but I'm looking, because I'm just rambling at this point, but I'm looking at some of the things, some of my reflections about the things of this place. So if you have anything that you want to say or ask me, let me know. I will say, one of my friends in Minnesota asked me about things I miss about Minnesota. I definitely miss a lot of the food because I was used to it. And so there are certain things that I miss eating. There's a really interesting thing about like ethnic food in a different place because it takes on that place. So that ethnic food is not like that in that home country, but it's particular to that place. Oh gosh, I really miss Mexican restaurants in the United States. The Mexican food, even made by Mexicans here, is different than it is in the United States, and you don't get it in quite the same way. But I'm trying to think, what else do I miss about Minnesota? I mean, I really value the lakes and the nature there too. I still miss a lot of places that feel really familiar, and close to my heart. Yeah, and I had a lot of exposure to Native American culture in Minnesota, which continues to be a part, especially of the Twin Cities there. And so I really miss the diversity of the Twin Cities and kind of the particular ethnic populations and how they interact in the Twin Cities. That's just different from other places that I've lived, but that's kind of what's coming to mind in the moment. And yeah, so here's the thing. I'm gonna keep on having these conversations. I certainly invite other people, both Latvians who have lived outside of Latvia, people who have moved to Latvia from somewhere else. And I actually have quite a number of friends from all these places that I've told you about that are also from other home cultures who have come to live in a new place. And so I would love to continue to have these conversations, and I'm basically going to have them as long as I have interest and energy. I'm not trying to make money off of this or become some like famous influencer. I'm just really enjoying being able to hear and share people's stories, so that people can get a sense of the big world of experiences people have had. Elina's asking about how much of Latvia I've seen. I would say that it kind of depends on what time period we're talking about. So as a kid, I've spent a lot of time in different parts of Latvia. My family is from southeastern Latvia in Latgale, and I spent a lot of time out in the countryside there. And when I did my summer high school, we actually rotated from different parts of Latvia every year. So also in kind of the southern part of Latvia near Lithuania, the northeastern part, which is kind of like a national parks area. I'm overgeneralizing here again. The western part, the western coast, which is very like a west coast. Like I really like the west coast of Latvia because they're really chill. It's different from different parts of Latvia. But again, I've been really shut in because of this pandemic. And I think it's really affected my adjustment as an expat who's moved to Latvia to be in Latvia. We don't have a car here because we live in the big city, and I have been driving for the majority of my life since I was 14 in the United States. Part of that is that the Latvian government has not been particularly easy in transitioning my driver's license. It's another gripe I had. I have not had good experiences with the Latvian driver's license bureau. And so I still also don't have a license. So basically, there's a really great public transportation system here in Latvia. In that, in the US, it doesn't exist, where you can't take a train to a city or a bus to a city. That being said, the pandemic has kept me away. I've not made the decision personally not to take a lot of trains and stuff in places. And so my ability to travel around Latvia has been limited. Yes, I did get to Latgale in the summer, which is super beautiful, and we've spent a lot of time locally, really close by, in a place called Vecāķi at the seaside, which has been really easy to get to by train and really beautiful. We spent some time out in the Gauja River Valley, which is kind of like a national park area. And we were taking trains up until about October. And then as things got more restricted here, basically the winter, it's been the winter of our discontent. We've all been inside, and I've tried to enjoy watching the snow, but I haven't really got much of anywhere. And I certainly am ready to get out of the city and be just out and in different places again. So I don't know how this story is going to change once the world feels open again. That's hard to predict, right? We're going day by day now, but there isn't a lot of ability to travel. And I think some of what I'm missing from certain places would be mitigated if I was able to go to those places. If I would have probably by this point in time gone back and visited family and friends in the US. I probably, would have gone a lot more around Latvia, a lot more around Europe. That was a big piece of us moving here, is that when you're in the US, you can travel around the US really easily, which is really wonderful. And I have traveled around the US. Actually, we did a giant road trip, a two-week road trip or so, and drove thousands and thousands of miles from the South to the Midwest, all the way out west through Colorado, through New Mexico, which was beautiful, to California and LA, which was really fun. But moving to Europe, I really wanted that access to be able to pop around Europe. And I have not had that ability. So I have some really, really dear family in Stockholm, part of my extended family. I see you watching, and was lucky enough to be able to go to Stockholm and have them come here before things got shut down. But I found myself really, really sorrowful around the fact and kind of resentful that I haven't been able to, that I can see that there's this thing that exists for me and I don't have access to it. So, it's so close. It feels so within reach, and yet like my access to it has been taken away. So I really miss that. Like that was something I really wanted that I feel like I haven't been able to get. I did luckily get to the Czech Republic before things shut down. That was last February. We actually met up with my husband's nephew, who was on a trip to Europe at the time. And I am so thankful that that happened at that time. And that even though I don't know, I think I wasn't like 100% sold on going to Prague, but again, with how hard Prague has been hit by, and the Czech Republic's been hit by what's going on, I am really really glad that we got there. But I felt like this sense of like, oh my gosh, like we get to do this all the time now. And then it was like the world said no. So I'd really love to be able to get even more like what's almost local to this area. I would like to see more of the countries around us. I've been to Lithuania and Estonia, but I haven't even been to Lithuania and Estonia since we've moved here a couple of years ago. And we've been here for about 1.5 years now. Probably should have said that at the beginning. So yeah, so I think I'm really, really missing that. Do I regret moving to Latvia? That's a great question. I I don't regret moving to Latvia. I don't regret taking on this challenge. I think it's been a lot different than I expected. It's challenged me in ways that I didn't expect. I think it's been particularly emotionally challenging for me because I felt a connection to this place and I felt like I belonged to this place before coming to it, in a different way than maybe other. I mean, I know a lot of Latvian Americans do feel a connection to this place, but because I had spent time here, because I had family here, I felt like, oh, I'm in. I'm in. I know, like I've been here. I'm just like I'm part of this. And then I basically, long story short, showed up here and didn't feel part of it. Felt like a real outsider. Still feel like a real outsider. And I think my on the worst days, it's like screw everything. I want to go back to what's familiar. And of course, the grass is always greener in those moments, right? So you just remember all the great things about all the places that you've been that are the best of those places. And on better days, I think for me, what it really comes down to is feeling like I'm in a place where I have a support system and people that I like around me, who are, and I'm able to accomplish things, and feel a sense of agency or ownership over what I'm doing. I haven't, frankly, found that in Latvia yet. And I don't know what that means. I mean, it might mean that I have a connection to this place, but ultimately it's not a place that I can live full time. Whether that means that I share my time between here and somewhere else, I don't know. Again, I feel like we've moved into a period of time that it's hard to plan anything more than day by day. So normally, typically by this point in time of the year, right, it's March, I would have made plans for the summer, maybe for the fall. Who am I going to see? Who am I going to visit? Where am I going to go? And I feel like I can't even answer the question of like when I'm going to go back to the States next and how long that visit's going to be or what that's going to look like. Thank you, Alina. I will definitely take you up on that offer to be part of the conversation. I think one thing I will say, I feel like I'm just talking on and on and on, but that's okay because this is my channel and I'm just here on a Saturday night. One thing I will say, which is interesting for me, is that I don't know that I particularly have felt like a space of belonging here. But I've met quite a few Latvians who have expressed to me that, how do I say this? That hold the weight of wanting to represent the entire place and saying to me that they really want me to feel welcome here and they want me to feel like I belong here. And I really incredibly appreciate those moments. Those moments have really given me hope and have helped to counterbalance some of the negative interactions that I've had, especially in bureaucratic places where people are just basically yelling at you, which like the New Yorker American in me really wants to yell back and really like wants to like set someone straight, which I can't do in Latvian. My Latvian is not that good, nor do I think it would be effective in the way. Like in the US, I know how to argue with someone and I know when I'm able to get my point across. In Latvia, I don't have a sense of how to do that. So I do appreciate that. I really appreciate when people are interested in sharing, and it's finding those people who are on the same wavelength as you, right? There are people who are on the same wavelength as you everywhere, But when you're in a place where you're like where you're vulnerable and your guards may be up, and also there's like communication issues, whether it's because people are different or because there's a language barrier, um, it can be really like, you know, how do I even do this? How do I approach this? And so yeah, I really value those times when I connect with people who are like, well, I try to speak for everybody here, and I'm sad that you've had some difficult experiences, and I really want you to have good experiences. And yeah, that's it's it's an overwhelming experience to live in a culture outside of your own. Um, and it's a constant like daily, hourly, maybe by the minute evaluation of who am I, like what components make make up me, and what of those things can I like be flexible on, what things can I adjust to, what things am I not willing to adjust to, um, and yeah, yeah, and I think I'm a combination of all of my experiences, as we all are. um, so that's part of my story, and I'm going to keep on having these conversations with folks. I'm invite you again, if you know folks who have come to Latvia, who would like to tell their stories. I'm trying to get people from all different parts of the globe who have come to Latvia. I'd love to talk to Latvians who have, either for study or for work or for other reasons, left Latvia and lived somewhere else, whether they've ended up returning to Latvia or they haven't returned to Latvia. I'm interested in talking to them as well, and hearing their perspective. And eventually, I kind of see this project also having some conversations with folks who don't necessarily have a connection to Latvia, but who I know have had a similar transition from one home culture to living in another one or in a few other ones. So thanks, everybody. I've really enjoyed kind of talking to you and talking to myself in the screen, but thank you so much for sharing this time with me. Thank you so much for sitting here for a while, and I look forward to continuing to converse with you in the future. Good night, everyone. Except it won't end. Now it will. Okay, good night.